the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, episode 94.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Welcome to another edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you on this episode. And a quick apology for the delays in the podcast. I went out of town last week and left all of my MP3 files on my computer and did not take them to edit and to get out the door. So I'm about to release a bunch of them to catch back up on the backlog. And so you will get all of them. If you're hearing this one, the rest of them should be out right now. Today, though, we have on guest Michael Lynch. Michael has worked in the petroleum and energy industries for about 4 decades, about half that time as an M.I.T. researcher. He has published in 6 languages. One of his recent books, The Peak Oil Scare and the Coming Oil Flood, was published last year by Praeger. We will link to that in the show notes. We'll also link to his Twitter feed where you can check him out and be sure to go follow his work there. And finally, we will also link to his website. Of course, you can find all of that at globalenergymedia.com in the show notes page. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Michael Lynch talking about peak oil demand. Well, Michael, it's a pleasure having you on the show today. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing good. Okay, so we're getting into a topic that actually I had a little bit of a discussion with someone on Twitter the other day about peak oil demand. For so long, peak oil has been a topic in the oil and gas industry. Peak oil demand is really catching steam. Kind of lay out, you have a book, The Peak Oil Scare and the Coming Oil Flood, which you can find on Amazon, and we will link for the listeners to pick up a copy. You have a book that talks about this. Give us the thesis of the book and what inspired you to write it.
Well, I've been working on oil and issues for about 40 years now, and I was kind of surprised to see that after we went through this debate in the late 70s, and I guess you say won the debate, in the late 90s, it came up again with peak oil. Geology is going to cause supply to peak and fall, and it's going to cause all kinds of horrible things like about the possible extinction of mankind. And another guy just said, well, you're not going to get your vegetables in the winter because nobody can afford to ship them.
Right. And so, let's go back to the 1970s and let's talk about that. What is your take on Hubbard? Some people, I've read kind of mixed reports about what people thought about what he was doing there. Some people say that he was really trying to do honest work and, he just was wrong. And some people say, no, he really kind of probably over-exaggerated some of the data he had. What is your take on his studies and what he was doing with the peak oil scare there?
M. King Hubbard was asked back in the 50s, gee, how much uranium are we going to need in nuclear power plants? And he said, well, first you got to know how much oil, gas, and coal there is. And more or less back of the envelope calculations, and said, well, oil production in the U.S. kind of looks like a bell-shaped curve, that just kind of a little bump up, fat in the middle. And if you assume that's true, then it's around 1970, and that turned out to be right. But because it turned out to be right, people thought somehow that it had become scientific as opposed to just an educated guess. And so you had the 2 oil crises in the 1970s, the Arab oil crisis and the Iranian oil crisis, which both with oil-producing countries being unable or unwilling to ship out supplies for political reasons, had nothing to do with geology, but it somehow confirmed in the public's mind and the media's mind the idea that, oil is really scarce and we can't keep increasing production. And you have this huge consensus by 1980, the price will never go down again. We have to develop synthetic fuels, that we should, try to preserve our gas and use coal and so forth. And of course, 5 years later, the oil price collapsed and stayed low for 15 years. So again, that kind of convinced people that, the predictions of scarcity were wrong, so without people really examining them too closely.
Yeah, and I still see that there are some peak oil proponents that are still out there today saying, hey, peak oil's coming, and there's a calculator that says how many days until we hit it. And for me, it looks as one of those things. It's like, we can't even currently, as I understand it, we can't even get all the oil out of the ground that we know is there. And so, this is just not cost effective, but there are ways we could get it out as, technology advances. Why do you think that this is still hanging around?
Well, this goes back to the whole work of Thomas Malthus, which he actually later rejected, where he said, I think population growth is faster than food production, and we can't fix it. And you had a revival of this in 1960, who wrote The Population Bomb and said within 10 years or so, we're just going to have global mass starvation and we can't stop it. And it was all the premise that, well, technological advance, I can't see where it's going to be. I can't, it's not going to happen, which is kind of silly. You could, if you're rolling down a hill, you can't say, there's nothing there. And so what you tend to find in the oil industry is you have people who say, I was drilling in, well, for example, one guy said my company was drilling in Peru, and we realized at some point there's not much oil left. And surely that's going to happen on a global level. Well, Peru still produces oil. People, especially a lot of novices, look out and go, oh my God, look how hard it is to produce oil. And they don't think about the fact that, well, maybe it's been hard for the last 150 years.
Right.
So and there's an amazing number of people who will write allegedly scientific articles when they have very superficial knowledge of the industry.
Okay, so the book is called The Peak Oil Scare and the Coming Oil Flood. So peak oil demand is, I'm assuming, where you're going with this. I think, when I've looked at some predictions for peak oil demand, it looks like some people are saying as early as 2040, and some people are saying that, hey, it could be 100 to 200 years off. What is kind of your thesis of the peak oil demand?
Well, some people, there's a few saying actually it could be as early as 2020, but that's based on this assumption that you're going to have this incredible improvement in lithium-ion battery technology, both performance and cost, and that consumers are going to rush out and buy all these things, and that they die. And it's all really aspirational. It mostly comes from people who want to believe it. When you try to say, what evidence do we have that everybody wants to buy electric cars, they say, well, look at, the sales of Tesla, for example. And you say, well, people are being given $7,500, $10,000 to buy those cars. If they're so wonderful, why do we need to give them that? And the few cases we have where governments stepped back and said, we're not going to give financial support for electric vehicles anymore, the sales dropped off pretty sharply. So it's a little bit of wishful. It comes especially from sort of the technological optimists and on the climate change people say, well, we really want them, so we'll assume it's going to happen.
Right, and you look at countries like or continents, rather, like Africa, and you sit back and you look at where they're at and what's going on there. There's obviously a lot of emphasis on renewables and solar, and we talked about in the show. But I think one of the things that we're going to see probably in the next decade is it feels like the pro-oil people are really pushing their side of the science. That maybe for the last, at least in my lifetime, it was always climate change, and now you're seeing a concerted effort to really push the pro-oil people's science, and so you have a huge battle that I think is going to take place over the next decade. And as that works itself out, I think what we're going to see is, okay, the climate change predictions, I'm not talking about people's intentions, but just that they've been historically wrong, and they've been wrong in huge proportions. It's not off a little bit, it's wrong in gigantic proportions. And so it feels like oil is actually catching steam, especially with these low prices. And you look at somewhere like Africa, where we need to get energy to people, it feels like oil is in a safe spot because you have a lot of people who you want to bring onto the grid eventually. What are your kind of thoughts on that?
It's a little bit like Marie Antoinette saying, let them eat solar cake, organic cake baked in solar ovens. The rich people in Europe and the U.S. talk about how the poor people in Africa should have expensive renewable energy. And they say, no, the problem is energy poverty and affordable energy. It's kind of unfortunate because I think it's not helping the development there. There are places where, if you're an isolated village, it may for the time being work to put in a solar installation or wind. But most of the time what you find is that renewables are much more expensive than conventional power, especially these days, natural gas fired gas produce pretty much the cheapest electricity after hydroelectricity.
Right, and it looks like, depending on who you talk to, but it looks like there's a large consensus that oil prices, no one's predicting $100 a barrel again anytime soon. I've seen some people say, well, maybe 65 to 70, we'll get back to that. But it looks like, at least for this year and next year, maybe the year after, 45 to 55 seems to be kind of the number, barring something, that no one's expecting. It would seem that also would kind of solidify oil's position in the market.
Yeah, it's people's views of oil prices are kind of funny because I've been writing about this since the early 90s and how people get it wrong and get it terribly wrong. The forecast for prices in the year 2000 were running like $150 to $200. The actual price was about $40, $50. I have one of the better records, and I've missed it pretty badly on a few occasions. The problem is people think that the price of oil has to go up, and that's just not true. It depends on depletion, which raises costs, but then also technology lowers cost, and they kind of compete with each other. And what you find for minerals generally is that the price tends to be long-term relative to inflation. When the price goes up sharply, it's kind of like with real estate. People say, oh, this isn't really a bubble. It'll never change. And if you say, well, you don't think it's because of the war in Iraq or the strike in Venezuela, and they go, no, I'm sure this time it's geology. This time it's because oil is finite. I've had I had a CEO of an oil company call me an idiot 5 years ago when I said the oil price would drop from $100 to $50.
One thing I think is interesting is if you go back to the early 2000s, there was headlines out there, oil prices spike because of fear of production stoppage in the Middle East. And not that production was stopping in the Middle East, it was this fear that would drive the price up of a war that might break out. And now we see that there's still global conflicts going on. We got the North Korea stuff going on, and there's stuff with ISIS and all this. And it's not even affecting the price on any real level. And as you mentioned, the war in Iraq. And so if you go back to the early part of the 2000s, just the fear of production shortages would seem to cause volatility to the market, and now it seems that the market is able to be stable no matter what we think is going on, at least with current global situations as they are.
Yeah, and there's a number of reasons for that. The biggest one is in the early 2000s, there was almost no spare capacity anywhere in the world. Nobody could ramp up production. Right now, OPEC has cut production about 1.2, and other countries about 500,000. And there's about 3 million barrels a day offline voluntarily that could be brought on tomorrow if, say, Venezuela collapsed into rioting and civil war. So people are feel a lot more secure about that. Also, the fact that shale oil production ramped up so fast makes people think, oh, this is not like, we're going to have a 10-year project to build an Alaska pipeline. The next time there's a problem, within a year or two, the oil supply will come back.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to get you out of here with this last question. Peak oil demand, will we actually see it for my listeners, let's say you're in your 40s, will we actually see peak oil demand in our lifetime, or do you think it's a little bit further out than that?
We might see it in our lifetime, mainly if somebody comes up with a better technology or a different fuel. We don't see that yet. It's not in sight. People tend to confuse, announcements of laboratory breakthroughs with availability of new revolutionary products.
Okay, well, the book is called The Peak Oil Scare and the Coming Oil Flood. You can get it on Amazon. We will link to that in the show notes. Michael, what else would you like to plug or promote before we let you off here today?
Well, I blog pretty regularly on Forbes.com, which is a business magazine, and I write about oil markets, but also energy policy, and occasionally I throw in a little humorous column, like my last one was, I'll be back with solar panels, help Arnie solve climate change.
I'm actually looking at your Twitter feed right now, and I saw that, so... we love getting on the Forbes contributors. We've had on several, and so we're glad to have you on and look forward to having you on again in the future to discuss this. There's a lot around the oil and gas industry, as you know, that you could discuss on a daily basis, so we appreciate your time, and we will link to all of that in the show notes so the listeners can go check you out at globalenergymedia.com. Thanks for coming on, Michael. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.